So good morning. I want to say just another quick word about Right Now Media. If you weren't here last week and you saw this video this morning, you're probably trying to figure out what is this all about. So the elders made a decision that we are investing in licenses for Right Now Media for all of the members of this church, at least all of those that we have your email addresses for. Now, as you could probably tell a little bit more from this week's video, Right Now Media is a collection of resources. Some of those are made for corporate worship. Some of them are made for Bible classes. Some are made for home devotional. But what this will provide is for each of you to have your own login to be able to get in and access these resources anytime you want to enhance your Bible study. Now, I'm going to warn you that if you are keeping up with your weekly study guides that go along with our sermons, this week's weekly study guide has 5 Right Now Media videos. And you won't be able to get to those videos unless you have the login. Now, our contract with them started today. It's official today. Did any of you get emails from them yet asking you to log in? Okay. I was going to be surprised if you did, because I'm expecting them to come tomorrow. I have an orientation session with them at like 11 a.m. tomorrow morning, and I expect they're going to send those out after that. So what I'm going to ask you is to check your emails tomorrow after, say, noon, and check your spam in case it might have got caught in your spam. You'll get an invitation email. It'll be an opportunity to put a login in, and then you will be able to get in 24/7 to those resources. And if you indeed want to keep up with your weekly things, you'll need one for tomorrow morning. Now, if you are not a member of this church, that's okay, because we would like to make this available to you if you are attending with us today. We know we have some visitors here with us today. We're very thankful that you guys are with us. If this is something you'd like to participate in, we will promise you we don't sell your emails to anybody. We're not going to hammer you with all kinds of stuff, but we will be happy to get your emails in and get you a login as well. So Greg said he got his, so that's good. Although you got yours because you were an elder and you were in early, so everybody else might not have gotten theirs. But if you would like to participate and you haven't got an email address with the church right now, please see me afterwards and give me that, and we'll get that in so that we can let you participate with that as well. Now, you're going to get one more commercial for this next week, so I will warn you of that right now, and then after that, we'll let it be. But we're excited about the resource, and we hope it'll be something that'll be beneficial to you as well. So today we do begin the next series in our series here on fundamentals of the faith. We talked for 6 weeks about what we believe in. But now that we have explored that, the question is, what do we do with that? And what we do with it is we seek to become more like Him. So I wanted to start by illustrating for you kind of how this idea of becoming like Jesus manifests itself. And I want to do that with a story from my childhood. So when I was a kid, I loved baseball and basketball. Grew up in Wichita, Kansas. St. Louis Cardinals were absolutely my team. We moved to Southern California when I was in 7th grade. The Los Angeles Lakers were my team. So my heroes were Bob Gibson with the St. Louis Cardinals, Jerry West, the Lakers, and then Stan Musial, who retired when I was only like 6 or 7 years old, but he was and still is the greatest of the St. Louis Cardinals. Now, I read their biographies. I wrote book reports for school on these guys. I had their posters up in my room. I've got autographs from Bob Gibson and Stan Musial. I've got everything. But most importantly, when I was a kid, I tried to imitate them. Jerry West had this great stand-up jumper. He'd Dribble, stop, stand up, straight up jumper. And I tried to emulate that jumper. That was the way I was going to shoot. I was going to be a star like Jerry West. Bob Gibson had this great windup. He'd kind of throw his glove back, big looping windup, throw it. Man, when I pitched a baseball, I was going to pitch it like Bob Gibson. And Stan Musial, for those of you who are old enough to remember him, and there aren't many of you in the room that are, had this interesting batting style. It was kind of this peekaboo crouch as a left-hander. Now, my problem was I was a right-hander. I knew that's why I wasn't going to be a star, because he was a left-hander, and I tried to be like him. The other reason I wasn't a star is I was short, I was slow, I was weak, I was asthmatic. I had absolutely no physical talent. But I loved these guys, and I followed them in every way I could. I wanted to be like them. Now, another word for that is discipleship. I was a disciple of these guys, their mannerisms, the way they played, the things that they did. And so, in a spiritual sense, discipleship is like that. It's becoming like Jesus. It's reading about him, it's writing about him, it's talking about him. At the end of the day, it's trying to imitate who he is. Discipleship is not just about inspiring us. It is about imitation. I love this quote. Discipleship is the art and science of helping people find, follow, and fully become like Jesus. Discipleship happens as God's people show love, share truth, and live life with one another, making new disciples along the way. Now, this word disciple comes from a Latin word which sounds very much like it. And that Latin word is discipulus, and it simply means to be a student. We often think of disciple as follower, and that's not inaccurate, but it's deeper than that. It's being a student of this person. And very closely linked to that word disciple is the word discipline. Comes from the same root, but a slightly different word in Latin, disciplina. And that word means instruction and learning. So disciple is the student, but discipline is the process of learning when you are a disciple. And so discipline is simply defined as the training that corrects or molds or perfects the mental faculties or the moral character. If we want to be like Jesus, we must learn to do what Jesus did, and we must exert the discipline to do that. But the discipline of a disciple of Christ is not one that is imposed by other people. Often when we think of discipline, we think of correction being imposed from the outside. You did something wrong, so now you are being disciplined. But this discipline is about our own self-discipline. And Paul talks about this when he's talking to Timothy. In the book of 1 Timothy, he says, discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness, becoming like God, becoming like Jesus. The author, theologian, professor, priest, Henry Nouwen said it like this: discipline means to prevent everything in your life from being filled up. Discipline means that somewhere you're not occupied, and certainly not preoccupied. In the spiritual life, discipline means to create that space in which something can happen that you hadn't planned or counted on. And so we're going to spend the next 6 weeks exploring some of these disciplines that will make us become more like Jesus. This list of disciplines that we will be working through comes from a book, The Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster. Now, I know there's at least one person in this room that has read this book, and that is Yong O. It is probably the preeminent book on spiritual disciplines, although there are many, many others that you can choose from. But his list of 12, and other people have a list of 8 or a list of 5 or a list of whatever, he has a list of 12, and it's a list we're going to be working through. And he divides them into inward disciplines, things that frame us, that we may do that other people might see. He defines some as outward disciplines, those that will be seen in the way we conduct ourselves and the way that we live. And then corporate disciplines, those that we would practice together as a community of faith. And so today, we're going to begin with 2 that, even though they're in the outward discipline group, I think are the foundational ones. And that is solitude and silence. In Luke chapter 5, verses 15 and 16, the author says this, "Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." Now, this idea of silence is one that is very, very, very foreign to us. If you are not one of these people on this screen, you know most everybody that you work with or live with who are. People who sit around all the time with earbuds in, playing on their phone when they're sitting at a table, or gaming and listening to music. Now, chances are that defines you. This quote from Elisha Goldstein, who wrote the article, "What 5 Minutes of Silence Can Do for Your Brain," says, "Whether you're in the camp who believes it or not, the pace at which we live our lives and the amount of things we try to pay attention to at once are major recipes for stress, anxiety, depression, and addictive behaviors." Well, let me give you some examples of that. I'm sure almost everybody here has got your phone with you today. Some of you may have turned it off, but I expect most of you just silenced it because you never know when something might come in. The average person in the United States today checks their phones 80 times a day. Now, if you're up 16 hours, that means 5 times an hour you're checking your phone. Now, if you're a millennial, you're an overachiever because the average millennial checks their phone 150 times a day. Right? That's like 8 times an hour. Right? No, wait, I did that wrong. It's more than that. Math isn't my primary profession. So I'm trying to get younger by the day, so I check my phone more often. And I figure that's going to help. Only 1 in 4 people can actually go to the bathroom without taking their phone with them to check it. All right? Now, if this hasn't gotten you yet, it will soon. Video games. The average respondent to a survey says that they now spend 16 and a half hours a week with video games. Now, you're probably thinking, I'm not that person. And I'm going to say, do you play solitaire on your computer? Do you play word space on your computer? Do you play Sudoku on your computer? You are a video gamer. All right? And you are playing some number of hours. It's not a surprise that younger people, my grandkids, love to sit down and they play Minecraft all the time. They play it with their friends who are all over the country now that are Minecraft people. But the fact of the matter is, older consumers, 55 to 64, that's actually young for me, but that's older according to the survey, account for 10% of online gamers now. And in fact, adults that are middle-aged, 45 to 54, now spend 59% more time and $76 more gaming than they did 1 year ago. So what about podcasts? You're like, I'm not one of these gamers and I don't check my phone like that. Okay, 25% of Americans now listen to podcasts. That's a good thing. And those who listen to podcasts average 6 hours and 40 minutes a week listening to podcasts. But fully 22% of those people actually listen to more than 22 hours of podcasts. And you may say, no. I'm not any of those people. So let's go to listening music. Average person listens to 18 and a half hours a week of music. That's the equivalent of 368 3-minute tracks. And I say, well, I don't do that, except that every time I'm in the car, I have Sirius XM radio on. And I'm in the car a lot. And you probably are too. You see, the fact of the matter is, we can't stand silence. I thought about just standing up here when I got up here today and standing here for a minute and staring at you and saying nothing. And it would have freaked you out because something's supposed to be happening and you're supposed to be talking. We expect there to be something happening. You know, we used to go to Honduras, and the good thing about going to Honduras was we didn't have really good service in the early years. And they told us, don't use the internet, you'll blow it up. And so we couldn't check our phones, and we couldn't really do anything. So we were isolated in Honduras. This year, if you look at the pictures, and I'm sure, Jason, you can go back through them, when we're sitting in the posada, every one of us is sitting there staring our phone. Rebecca gave a daily, sometimes 2 or 3 times daily, update on Facebook of the activities that we were doing there because we are so used to communicating through our phones now. When we were on the plane, the first thing that we did was either turn on a movie or put in our earbuds and put on music. We cannot stand to be silent. And the fact of the matter is, as the amount of inputs that we're putting into our minds is increasing, the amount of mental health issues, loneliness, and isolation that people are feeling is exponentially increasing because we make no space for silence in our lives. C.S. Lewis, the great writer, said, "We live, in fact, in a world starved for solitude, silence, and private, and therefore starved for meditation and true friendship." So what is solitude? Solitude is inner fulfillment. It is chosen separation for the purpose of refining and refreshing your soul, letting God and His voice be the input that we allow into our minds. Solitude is not loneliness. Loneliness is a state of being alone where we crave relationship. It's a sense of inner emptiness. Solitude, on the other hand, is this sense of inner fulfillment of being in the presence of God. And solitude is not isolation. Isolation is frequently, most often, involuntary detachment. We put people in solitary isolation in jail because when they are starved of input, we can finally control them. And so that becomes the worst punishment, is to isolate someone. We put kids in timeout to isolate them because they can't stand it to be isolated. And in the state of isolation, we crave companionship. But in solitude, we have that sense of the presence of God. We have that sense of His compassion or His companionship with us. Isaiah spoke about it this way. This is what the sovereign Lord, the Holy One of Israel, says. Only in returning to me and resting in me will you be saved. So, how did Jesus use solitude, and what can we learn about its benefits in our lives from watching His example? Well, first of all, solitude strengthens resolve. The Gospel of Mark is the shortest gospel, and in many ways, it is the one that is the quickest. Mark doesn't talk at all about Jesus' birth. He picks up immediately at Jesus' ministry. He uses the term immediately 39 times in 16 chapters. He's in a hurry to tell the essentials of this story. And yet, Mark opens his book by talking about Jesus' decision and practice of going into solitude. In Mark chapter 1, verses 9 to 14, it says, At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, You're my Son, whom I love. With you I'm well pleased. At once the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended to him. Oftentimes when we think about Jesus going out into the wilderness, we tell the story about him going out there and fasting for 40 days because we think that made him weaker, that made him more vulnerable to Satan's temptations. But one of the articles I was reading and preparing for this said, we're thinking about this all backwards. When Jesus went out there for 40 days, he went out there to be alone with God, to be strengthened in that relationship with God. And when Satan came to him thinking he would be weak and he was vulnerable, Jesus was at his most prepared to thwart Satan's temptations by calling upon the words of God to set him back. Solitude gives us the strength, the resolve to face the things that are going to be difficult in life and to come out with only the strength that God can give. The second benefit of solitude is also found in that same first chapter of Mark, the idea of clarifying priorities. Verse 32, That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all of the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he wouldn't let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, Everyone is looking for you. Jesus replied, Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come. So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. It's interesting because Jesus is having people come to him early in his ministry here, and he's healing them, and good things are happening, and it would be really easy for him to become comfortable. Okay, people are coming to me. I can preach the word. I can heal people. I can do everything right here. But he sets himself apart. He goes out to pray. And when he is finished in that time of solitude, and the apostles say, hey, get back here. Everybody's looking for you. It's time for you to get started again. He says, no, no, no. We need to go somewhere else. That's really why I came, is to go out to other people as well. So now we're going to go to Galilee. We're going to go to the surrounding areas. We're going to spread the word differently. When we start to get stuck inside our routine, inside of our vision, our priorities, solitude provides us that opportunity to step back and seek to find what it is that God really wants from us, to clarify the priorities that are in our life. The third lesson or benefit that we can get from solitude is that it illuminates decisions. On Luke chapter 6, verse 12, it begins this way. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. It's interesting that although we can argue that Jesus was God, he knew all things, and when he came to earth, he might have already known who he was going to pick for his apostles. When it came time for him to make that decision, he went alone. He went off by himself, and he spent the entire night in prayer. And when he came back, he was ready to make what became a momentous decision. Who are these 12 people going to be that are going to follow me and carry out this message? We were talking in Bible class this morning about how the Jewish leadership thought they could cut the head off of the snake when they killed Jesus, and that this movement would die. But Jesus had prepared 12 men, one who became a traitor, who was ultimately replaced, who then carried out this mission. And he made that decision after going into solitude. The fourth, I'm one behind. The fourth benefit of solitude is that it refreshes the spirit. Back in Mark chapter 6, verse 30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." And so they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. Jesus had picked these apostles. He sent them out on a mission, and they started getting busy. They were busy, and they had more to do than they had time to do. In fact, they didn't even have time to eat. And Jesus knew if you get caught in that trap, you're going to ultimately fail. And so when they came back and they were all excited, and it doesn't say that they didn't have enthusiasm. It doesn't say that they didn't want to go back out and keep going, that they weren't enjoying this busyness. They're giving him a report, and they seem to be very enthused about it. And he says, let's stop. Let's go back and let's rest. The first thing he trained them to do was to go and to teach and to heal. The second thing he trained them to do was to come back, to get rest, and to go to a solitary place where they could get strength for the battle. The fifth benefit of solitude is that it soothes grief. Matthew chapter 14. The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in prison. His head was brought in on a platter, given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. And then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. We can only speculate how close Jesus and John were. Certainly, Mary and Elizabeth had a relationship that occurred before either of them were born. And there's every likelihood that they knew each other and grew up with each other. And Jesus knew that John was going to fulfill this mission of being the one that would prepare the way for him. And likely Jesus knew he would pay for it with his life. But when that moment comes, Jesus doesn't surround himself with friends to help comfort him. Jesus goes away to a solitary place. Not to be lonely, but to be in communion with God. To fill that emptiness with God. You know, oftentimes when we or those we love are faced with loss, we feel like, and with all of the right motives, that we need to surround them and love them, and we should. But we also have to encourage and give them space for solitude. A place where they can come to grips with being in the presence of God, beginning this new life in this new way with a new strength that they are relying upon. The sixth benefit of solitude is that it empowers surrender. Luke chapter 22, beginning with verse 39. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, if we read the account of Matthew of this very same event, it's a much longer account, so I chose the shorter one to put on the screen. But Matthew says, Jesus went away to pray and begged God, "Take this away from me. But if you won't, your will be done." And then he came back to the disciples and he was upset that they were sleeping and they weren't praying with him. He goes back and he prays exactly the same prayer again. "God, please take this away from me. But if you won't, your will be done." He comes back a second time, finds them again sleeping, is not happy with them, goes back a third time, and Matthew says he prayed exactly the same prayer again. But when he came back after the third prayer, he says to the disciples, "Get up, let's go. It's time for this to be done." When he was struggling with this decision, so much that sweat drops like blood were coming out of his forehead, he got his strength from his moments of solitude with God. And he was willing to surrender his will. Now here is a God, a man, who knew that he came to earth for this moment, for this suffering. And yet, when that moment came, he struggled with it. And he needed that strength of being alone with God to get him through it. How much more those of us who are not God's, who don't know beforehand what that mission is for us, how much more do we need those moments with God to give us strength, to give us clarity, to give us resolve for that which is ahead of us. And finally, solitude distills the voice of God. And for this one, moving away from Jesus' life for a moment and moving back to the verse that Andrew read for us earlier, the story of Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19. Now, to set a little context for this, what we may not remember is before Elijah was on this mountain and God was bringing these great events before him, and God was not in the earthquake, and God was not in the wind, and God was not in the fire. God was ultimately in the whisper. What had happened before this was one of the greatest moments of Elijah's life had taken place. He had gone up to the mountain against 450 prophets of Baal, and he had challenged them. See if your God will burn up your sacrifice. And he let them have 3/4 of a day. And they were begging and praying and yelling and screaming and doing everything they could. And they couldn't get the flame to light. Their God was silent. And Elijah goes over, pours water all over surrounds it with water, prays to God, and God lights up the fire. All 450 of Baal's prophets are killed. It's a moment of great triumph for Elijah. But what happens immediately after that is Jezebel, who was employing those 450 prophets of Baal, was not happy with what had taken place and said, I don't care where you go or what you do, but I will find you and you will die. And he was scared. And so he ran. After his moment of greatest triumph, he was at his most vulnerable. And can you imagine? He had just seen the power of God in such a mighty way, and yet when she said, you're going down, he was scared to death. And he runs. And God has him not only run, but run to a brook, and he feeds him at this brook, and then God has him run up to this mountain. This quiet, completely secluded spot where there was no one else. And God shows him mighty things. And he assumes, well, that's God speaking, because God did these mighty things at this altar of Baal. So when those mighty things happen, that's the voice of God. But God wasn't in the earthquake. And he wasn't in that mighty wind. And he was finally in the quiet whisper. And when God confronted him in that quiet whisper, he said, okay, Elijah, why are you here? Elijah said, well, I'm scared to death. And God says, let me tell you what you can do about that. We look for mighty signs. We look for God to act in big and visible ways. And what God calls us to do is to be alone with Him and to find strength in His presence in moments of solitude. There's a story about Mother Teresa. As she became famous, I think it was in the 1980s, Dan Rather decided he was going to do an interview with her, and he managed to set up an interview in a studio, and she came, and he's asking her a variety of questions, but he finally says, Mother Teresa, what do you say in your prayers to God? She thought for a minute, and she said, I listen. And that kind of threw Dan Rather for a loop. Wasn't the answer he was expecting. And he kind of stumbled around for a second. He says, okay, so what does he say to you? And she smiled and said, he listens. The point of being in solitude with God is not necessarily to hear the audible voice. It is to allow God to speak to us in that moment of silence, removing the clutter, removing the noise, centering ourselves in the priorities. So the question is, how do we begin? Before that question, there's one other slide. So solitude goes with stillness, right? You can be in solitude and be talking all the time. You can have podcasts on and say, hey, I'm doing my quiet time, right? But solitude with God is truly stillness. Do any of you guys remember what it was like March of 2020 when everything shut down for COVID? Do you remember how that felt? You went outside, there were no cars on the road, there were no airplanes in the sky. It was just dead still. You remember that feeling? And it was unnerving because there's always noise. And there was no noise because everything had come to a stop. There was stillness. Zechariah says, be still before the Lord, all mankind, because he's roused himself from his holy dwelling. In the Psalm, it says, be still and know that I am God. And in Habakkuk, the Lord is in his holy temple. All the earth, be quiet in his presence. So how do we begin with stillness, with silence, and with solitude? Number one, reserve a time each day. We will fill every single second of our day. Second we get up, we'll turn on the TV, or let the radio continue to play and listen, or immediately go and check our phones. My habit is I get my wordscapes and my Sudoku out of the way right away so I get my credit for doing it today, right? But we immediately start into routine. And it becomes very, very, very easy to leave God behind. Where is your time? My dad was a master at this. He got up at 4:30 in the morning, every morning. He would go down on the sofa, and that was his alone time with God. I would usually get up at 6 o'clock or so I could go read the sports pages and find out how Bob Gibson did. And Dad would be there with his Bible and his commentary and his notebook. That was his quiet time with God. Maybe you're not a morning person. Maybe for you, it's the last 30 minutes at the end of the day. Maybe it's 30 minutes at lunchtime when you just pull yourself away. And if you're at work, you go sit in the car by yourself. Carve out a time each day. Secondly, identify a place. When Vanessa and I were young marrieds, we had some friends, a couple that were in the church with us, and they had built a prayer closet in their house. They had a small little, it was almost like a closet under the stair kind of a deal, and they put a small desk in there with a lamp. They put a couple of inspirational scriptures up on the wall and a couple of devotional books. That was their prayer closet. When they went in there, they closed the door. That was their place to be with God. My place is I love to walk. I love to go out and walk. I like to hear the birds singing, and I like to feel the 95-degree heat and 120% humidity that's going on right now. But I enjoy walking. And when I'm outside, I feel that presence of God. When Jason is in Honduras, he has a rock that he goes to up above the Posada. And every morning he will grab his coffee and he'll walk up to that rock. and it overlooks this incredible valley. And that is Jason's centering time in the morning. If you don't have one, make one. Identify a place that is your place and your time with God. So how do I focus that time? How do I not just sit there and have my mind wander while I'm there? You can choose Scripture. As a matter of fact, there are 15 Psalms tucked toward the end of the Psalms from 120 to 134 that are called the Psalms of Ascent. It is thought by most people that these Psalms were written as David and a couple of them by other authors were walking up to the temple. So as they would make their journey up to the temple, they were inspired by that opportunity to be in the presence of God. And these Psalms were the result of it. They're Psalms that start off with words like, lift up your eyes into the hills. They're all about looking upward, thinking about God. Pick a psalm, pick a single verse, and just reflect on that verse. I saw one where one man said, I work my way through the alphabet and I think about what are the attributes of God. He is almighty. He is beautiful. He is creator. I can't do this for all of them, by the way. But that was his deal because it made him stop and think about God in different ways. This isn't about tricks or techniques. It's about centering. Find that thing that will center you in thinking about God. Next week, we'll talk about prayer and meditation, but pray when you're in solitude. Almost every time when it talks about Jesus going to a solitary place, it said, and he prayed. It's about being there with God. And maybe your prayer is like Mother Teresa's. Maybe it is just listening for the guidance and for the direction of God. But stop and listen. And when you first start, this will be tough because we long for activity. So I'll take my phone with me, and if nothing's really happening, at least I can check, what's going on. Or, hey, you know what? I'll do this while I'm washing the dishes because they need to be done. And we'll find some activity that we have to do because we cannot stand to sit there and do nothing and just think about God. So in the beginning, it will be really, really, really hard to do this. So take 5 minutes in the beginning and then expand it to 10 and then expand it to 15. Start small and grow from there. This is about learning to be in the presence of God. A man by the name of Mike Cosper wrote a book, and he said, solitude has a learning curve. It's a practice we embody, and like anything worth doing, our first efforts will be pained. The terror of silence, as David Foster Wallace calls it, will tempt us away from the quiet. We will long for email, to-do lists, a sink full of dishes, the unread messages on our phone, anything that can turn our attention away from that quietly simmering something that makes solitude so troubling. So we practice solitude like a beginning violinist. We practice poorly. But poor practice, marked by a wandering and a restless mind, isn't bad practice. Done with some regularity, it can become rich. We can discover a space in our hearts and in our world where the Lord meets us. As we'll see, it's the beginning of the end of our religious efforts. A chance to face both the reality of our spiritual poverty and the wealth of God's spiritual blessings. Silence is not empty. It is full of answers. And we'll end this morning with a video.
To boost its interest rates up to 18% as it battles against financial collapse. The move is designed to stabilize the
And their economic messages to win the support of undecided voters, with